My name is Alyson Myers, and I own a young oyster company on the coast of Virginia that harvests shellfish from a creek near the Atlantic Ocean and delivers them to urban restaurants 3.5 hours later. So we're going from one area all the way down to in the water to organisms. It's a pleasure to provide a food product to our market, and we could have rapid growth with some hard work. The problem is our waterways are changing because of greenhouse gases. We will have warmer water temperatures and a more acidic environment. These will affect my industry, but their effects go beyond my industry to the health of oceans. I'm not a scientist. I'm a business person and an average citizen. One of the questions in front of us today is how will climate change and ocean acidification affect the industry and the economy? I hope to give you some basics on this, but the truth is we're just now quantifying the dynamics of the changes in the aquatic environment and how these changes will affect various organisms. The quick message is business requires stability to plan and invest, and we're entering a time of high instability. The principal cause is a basic one. If you fill up a cup of water, it will eventually overflow. We are loading our environment with CO2 very quickly, and the world is now responding. Organisms have a range of tolerance, like us, for food, temperature, oxygen, and CO2. We're now warming the aquatic environment, our oceans, and our waterways are becoming more acidic. Like any acid, it's corrosive, especially to the shell and those organisms that require shell to live, and others that depend on those organisms for food. You may think I'm referring to fish and other predators, and I am, the food web, but I'm also referring to us. We depend on our waterways for water, food, tourism, and more. In fact, 39% of our citizens live by the water. The size of the shellfish market is approximately $1.2 billion in the US. It's a growing industry because shellfish are fun to eat and they contain nutrients from the sea that are good for us. Before I go on, who likes oysters? Okay, good. Dependable market. Okay, so let's take a look at how a young oyster company operates. So we buy young oysters at about 1/4 inch in size. So this is just after the larvae period. So these are known as oyster seed. We put them in floating mesh bags where the current brings them food, tiny plants known as algae, brought up before. The oysters grow at a good clip, and all the while the oysters filter the surrounding water, so up to 40 to 50 gallons a day. Next slide. The oysters, as they grow, get transferred from smaller mesh bags to larger, and after 1.5 years, they're about market size, which is 3 inches. We pull them out, we wash, we count, we bag them, we ice them, and we deliver them to urban areas. From creek to table, 3.5 hours. The market's growing. So there's huge opportunity when you have a quality product. And we, the industry, need to invest. Above all else, business needs dependability. So you can see where I'm going with this. We need a dependable environment, dependable seed and price, and a growing market. The problem is power plants and cars are emitting greenhouse gas into the environment. So I have a similar slide to Sarah up here because I think it's simple for y'all and your readership. Our waterways are warming. Central to our industry is the salinity and the condition of our waterways, the ecosystem, and the temperature of our oysters. This is why oysters are often named for their creeks and bays. It's a point of pride. Regulation of our industry is based on product temperature. This is designed to keep you safe and make me worry. You've heard of eating shellfish in the R months. There's a reason for this. The water and air are cool. So why is temperature important? Certain times of year, bacteria is present in the water in high concentrations. For people with compromised immune systems, elevated levels of certain bacteria, Vibrio, can cause illness or death. I won't go into details. Next slide. So we have rising sea levels and we have warming seas, and our operations are on the coast. Buildings, docks, water leases. Our investments are dependent on current locations. If sea levels rise, our areas are affected. Climate change also brings extreme storm events that can drop inches of fresh water into your saline growing area and threaten your product. Or they can wash fecal coliform from animals into the waterway and cause a shellfish area closure, so we can't harvest. These things take the fun out of earning a living with a great product and give you a headache. That said, I eat oysters straight out of the creek, and there's nothing like it. So I'm going to skip the chemistry here because Sarah and Whitman have done a great job with that. The basic thing when people don't want to talk about chemistry is I look at this slide and I go from left to that green shell over to the red shell, and it shows you what you need to know. So low pH means more acid and dissolving shell, or the inability to form shell. So larvae are the most susceptible, in my understanding, because they've yet to form their shell. But I imagine seed are also impacted as well for slowing growth rates. If oyster seed cannot develop shell, we're out of business. Or we have a slow death, kind of like the oyster in acidic water. Our production slows down, our crop takes more time to get to market. This means bigger labor costs, less money for us in the economy, and less filtering for the ecosystem. The biggest part, uncertainty. No business wants uncertainty unless there's a huge upside. And these are oysters, not tech. So Whiskey Creek, a larvae business based in Oregon, 2007, experienced a high larvae mortality. Water sample was sent to Oregon State, and sure enough, it showed a low pH. We've talked about it a little bit today. George Walbusser was head of a study having to do with Whiskey Creek, and he said that the first 24 hours after fertilization are the most important. So the larvae builds their shells. Without it, they cannot build their internal organs and feeding and swimming appendages, which they need to survive. They don't have a lot of time because they don't have a lot of energy stored up. For a page turner on this, turn to Whiskey Creek Shellfish Acid Tests. It's the marine version of 24. The big lesson in this is industry and university partnered to find a solution. One solution is to counter the acid of the water with soda ash, which acts like an antacid, raising the pH level. This is an example of adaptation. So it's been mentioned before, this was a case of natural upwelling, so being exacerbated by local conditions, but it allowed scientists to study the condition of acidic water. So, given this, how's industry feeling? So going back to George, who did the study in Oregon, he says, out here, oyster hatcheries and some setting stations are now buffering water with sodium carbonate to deal with the short-term impacts on larval and seed success. Interestingly, some places have taken measures to also reduce greenhouse gases. Whiskey Creek Hatchery has removed their diesel hot water heater for a natural gas unit, while Taylor's Hatchery has installed an electric car charging station, and their main public relations person is now driving a hybrid. Lessons from the West Coast. Partnerships matter, but it is a two-way exchange. There's a lot to be learned from industry if scientists will listen. All right, without monitoring equipment, adaptation is not possible or poorly informed. The hatcheries here may be out of business if it was not for the CO2 monitoring equipment. What should we do? Reduce fossil fuel emissions is the only long-term solution, but we've already created significant changes in ocean chemistry, so we have to be thinking about mitigation and reducing local drivers, which exacerbate the global signal. Restoring resilience of coastal ecosystems and habitats is a good starting point. So what George is talking about here is that healthier ecosystems are more resilient. That means let's clean up our waterways, and then we have a chance. So more from industry. Bob Rowe from the East Coast Shellfish Growers Association. He says we have 1,100 farms, provide about 3,000 direct full-time jobs, and another 2,000 seasonal and part-time jobs. We produce 125 million in farm gate. That's 59% from clams, 39% oysters, 2% mussels. Clam production's pretty flat. Oysters doubled in the past 5 years. We've been lobbying for ocean acidification in D.C., briefing the Democratic Senatorial Outreach Committee, the Senate Oceans Caucus, and the Congressional Shellfish Caucus. There's much we do not know about this issue. As far as mitigation and adaptation strategies, we need to know how this is going to affect us before we can propose concrete steps. We know we have some ability to selectively breed animals that are more resistant to dissolution, so we're advocating for breeding work. We know we can mitigate the worst effects in hatcheries. For coastal-induced acidification, there's a potential to sweeten muds with shell and limestone additions. Additionally, they're recommending for congressional action, support research funding for acidification studies with NOAA, and shellfish breeding programs to develop acid-tolerant lines of shellfish with USDA. Support national legislation and state programs that will reduce CO2 emissions. Support carbon cap and trade programs and carbon tax proposals. Dan Richoff, a scientist at Duke, notes, industry, know your environment, know your organism, plan. Low salinity areas are affected more because salt buffers, which we've just heard about, especially with low flushing and shallow depth. Organisms that can move will, stationary ones will select for adaptation. The upper Chesapeake Bay, he believes, will be more affected. And again, keep an eye on sea level rise. Stan Allen with VIMS. Regarding the effect of pH on hatcheries, this is somewhat unclear on the East Coast, and more particularly an estuary where pH changes significantly. Okay, so some of that we've already been through. Just a review of East Coast, West Coast, the Gulf Coast, recovering from an oil spill. So this is an unpublished study by Becky Mabardi, who's working with George Waldbusser. So this is really not for publication. It's just to show you some information. So she did a survey of West Coast growers and the public. The slides are pretty self-explanatory, but I'll run through them. This one shows the, let's see. It basically shows those who understood ocean acidification, so along the horizontal axis, and they were more apt to be concerned about it. Next slide. Okay, so this shows the difference between industry and the general public. So industry are the tall figures, and public are the smaller ones. So obviously, we're the ones that are affected, so we're going to be most concerned. We're going to need action, and the public will come along when they do, when they understand it, hopefully when you present it to them. Okay, so this slide is about the potential to adapt. Most people feel like there's some potential to adapt. We've just heard about that with the hatcheries. So these are just some quotes from folks. I'll include these in the final PowerPoint if I'm able to. So we've been farming in the Oregon Territory for 160 years. We will survive global warming and ocean acidification. Short term, we can adapt. Long term is unknown. That's an oyster grower. I think hatcheries can adapt through broodstock development, monitoring, and/or chemically treating water. The organisms in the ocean, on the other hand, well, they might not be as fortunate. And that's an oyster grower in Washington State. Here's a clam farmer from Washington as well. I call this dealing with Mother Nature. I cannot change what comes at me from the world. So obviously, business people tend to adapt and move with their product. Okay, so benefits of action. So obviously we have jobs, we have GDP, and we retain a valuable source of protein and a part of this country's history. Remember, oysters are good neighbors. They help us retain the health of our waterways. So this is a slide that I thought was appropriate for the crowd because it presents the information very, very simply. It's on the Natural Resources Defense site, so you can check that for yourselves. So how do we address the problem? What can we do? We must get the stakeholders around the table. This means scientists talking to the private sector. Both groups solve problems. Let's take advantage of everyone's strengths. Typically, I'm the only business person in scientific meetings. I'm getting a little tired of it. Okay, action. So, cut back on carbon emissions to decrease change in our environment. The longer we wait, the bigger the job. It will be very expensive. Business costs must take into account the life cycle of its products and service. And there I'm really referring to carbon. Scientists and business must work together. Scientists look at how things work. Business is good at fixing problems if they have the knowledge. Business looks for opportunity. In a way, this is the biggest opportunity of our lifetimes. Government and nonprofits can be a great catalyst. Also, regulation. Business must have the incentives to solve problems. Government can fund innovation or punish those who harm the social value of a functioning environment. And for the shellfish industry, know your environment, know your organism, pay attention to your salinity, your depth, and your proximity to the ocean. Plan, and plan to adapt. Change is on the way. So I couldn't help but include a little inspiration corner. I don't know about y'all, but there's nothing more fun than fixing a problem. So let's put our best minds and some guts together to fix this one. Everyone has a part, but we all need to get to work now. And obviously our waterways need us. So we have a growing population. This is not the topic of this talk, but I do want to take a moment and talk about water supply. A very small percentage, about 1% of our water is fresh. It needs to be conserved. Our saline water supply provides an opportunity. Let's start growing more food, feed, and materials in our oceans. But first, let's take care of our waterways. Let's examine a new model of business where we take care of the resources that provide us goods, whether our air or our waterways. We must plan for the future. So this is a, this is a waterway that has very high levels of nutrients. And as you can see, algae, this is, in this case, macroalgae, is growing out of control. It's an area of second homes for people, vacation homes, and they want to know why this stuff is growing in their canals. So we're doing some work in this area and looking at that. So another inspiration corner. So at Kegotank Farm, we're looking at new ways to respond to climate change. Again, this is through a business lens. So, and we're not scientists, so we're just looking at the situation and saying, all right, what can we do? So if we have rising sea levels, how can we maintain agricultural productivity on land that's had salt? So halophytes, the flower to the right, it's a marshmallow. We're experimenting with the University of Delaware on planting those on pretty low land to see what it can do and then what the plant can be used for. On the left is macroalgae. That's an interest of mine. We put nutrients into water, plants grow. So this is a form that can be harvested, and because our area is aquaculture, what can we do to harvest that material, put it on a growing system, harvest the material and put it to use as a raw material for industry. When Sunshine asked me to speak today, I didn't know what I could add to the conversation. The simple story is that shellfish farmers love what we do. We love being on the water, even when it's cold, because the oysters are better. We love giving kids their first oysters and telling them to close their eyes and think of the ocean and how good our food is for them. I tell them they'll be healthy for a week. even though I don't know that this is exactly true. But there's magic in the ocean, and a dose of magic makes everyone feel better. This is why our population lives near the coast, because we love the beauty and the unseen life of the ocean. Our team at Kegotank Farm invests our profit in solving waterway issues because we cannot imagine a life without a dynamic and diverse ocean. In fact, we depend on it. Everyone in this room is here for the same reason. Whether you're government, nonprofit, journalist, scientist, each one is valuable for the project. If we solve it, we can all be proud. In fact, the ocean depends on us, but as importantly, we depend on our oceans. If you have a conversation with someone who doesn't understand our problem with CO2, explain to them that oceans absorb a third of our CO2. Ocean chemistry is changing, and oysters and shellfish will no longer be able to form their shell. This will disrupt all the organisms that depend on them for food, known as the food chain. In an instant, they get the whole picture. It's about dinner and the health of our oceans. Thank you for your time. Good luck with your work.